for alumni and parent engagement at Claremont McKenna College. It is a thrill to have all you here. I mentioned this earlier, but I hope everyone is safe and healthy. I hope your families are all doing well. We're all in this together, of course, so know that the college is here to support you and support all of our students, faculty, and staff as well. This is week 2 of a number of virtual programs that we've created to help support our community, to keep you all connected to each other, but also to the college. And it's a silver lining in a very uncertain world right now. So we are thrilled to have Professor Amy Kind with us to speak to us about some of her research and what she's passionate about. But it's also just great to see all of you and to let you all know that we are continuing to support you however we can. We're moving programs virtual. We're also pushing spring programming into the fall, and we hope to see you all on campus very soon. So on behalf of the college, it is my pleasure to introduce our second professor talk of our virtual program. If you don't follow us yet on Instagram or Facebook, please do on Instagram at CMC Alumni and Families. And there's also a new CMC Community private Facebook group. Just type in CMC Community there, and you can stay connected and up to date on all the things that are going on. You can also start a number of conversations on the Facebook group. Today, we're thrilled to have Professor Amy Kind, Director of the Gould Center for Humanistic Studies and the Russell K. Pitzer Professor of Philosophy at CMC, discuss imagination before and during the COVID-19 pandemic. Professor Kind will speak and share some slides. So at some point, your screen is going to go to her screen, so don't be too nervous. That's normal, and she'll take us through a few things. And then we'll go into Q&A, and we promise to be done on the hour. For the question and answer portion, please either enter your question in the chat feature, or you can, there's a button there that says raise your hand. And if you raise your hand, then I will click unmute on you and ask you to ask a question, but I'll give you a reminder of that when we go to questions in just a bit. So without further ado, I hand it over to Professor Amy Kind. Amy, thank you.
Thanks, Evan. I have to say I was getting a little emotional as all these names were coming up. I think I have some students who were in the very first batch of students I taught when I started at college in 1997. So some people I haven't seen in a very long time. And anyway, I just wish I could say hi to each one of you individually. I see some parents of students. I see some people I work with now at the Gould Center and work with at the college. And in this time of social isolation, it's just, I just can't tell you how great it is to see all your faces. It's just, it's great. So with that little emotional start, I'm going to share my screen and get started on this talk, which draws on my longstanding research project in imagination, but it really picks up on some sort of personal reflections. I mean, not too personal, but some personal thoughts that I have been having over the last few weeks. And so the sort of genesis for the idea of this talk and just some things I have been thinking about lately is, you know, I was like so many people, I was staring at the cupboards and thinking like, why on earth didn't I buy that extra, you know, 6-pack or 12-pack of toilet paper when I was in the store, you know, last week, right? So, I mean, I remember at the beginning of March being in the store and thinking like, oh no, it doesn't matter, right? Like this, I don't need to pick up that extra toilet paper. I don't need to really worry about this. And in retrospect, it turns out that that was just a tremendous failure of imagination, right? Like I just failed to imagine how bad things were going to get and what the world was going to be like. And so I started thinking like, wow, I work on imagination and I'm exhibiting all these failures of imagination in various ways. And it just got me thinking about what happens when we experience the unexpected. So that's sort of how I started thinking about these ideas in this particular context. So I'm not the only one who's been thinking about failures of imagination in connection with this pandemic. So there have been headlines all over the place, New Republic, CNN, Boston Globe, these are from all different sites, about ways in which there is a failure of imagination going on right now. And then interestingly, it's also not the first disaster, international or national disaster, in which these very same points about a failure of imagination have been made. So going back to the 9/11 Commission report, there was this, for me, very interesting set of remarks in the 9/11 Commission report where they said they were bemoaning the failure of imagination in leading up to appropriate planning for 9/11. So people just couldn't imagine that, or didn't imagine that planes could be used as weapons in this way, or that the suicide bombers would be intent on a certain kind of destruction, right? And willing to sacrifice their own lives in the fashion that they did. So the 9/11 Commission said, imagination is not a gift usually associated with bureaucracies. It's therefore crucial to find a way of routinizing, even bureaucratizing the exercise of imagination. And so there's this idea that we really, it seems almost counterintuitive, right, to routinize imagination, but we need, going back to what they were saying back in 2001, we really need to start imagining in new ways in order to prepare ourselves for the future. And so we're seeing, I think, some of these same failures of imagination now. So I guess what I wanted to do just to start off is just a quick rewind. And I found this useful for myself, just to remind ourselves, even though it's only been, say, a month or 6 weeks. I mean, it feels like forever that we've been locked in our houses, but it's been actually a very short time. But I thought it was useful to just think about like where we were, even just, on March 1st or 6 weeks ago or something like that. And so, you probably remember that the first reports of these cluster of cases of pneumonia were at the end of last year, December 31st. And it was the beginning of January when we were told that there was a novel coronavirus here. And then we had the first confirmed case in January 20th up in Washington. But I was just thinking about like ourselves and our own planning, right? And actually CMC did, I have to say, a really great job of planning. We had planning for just disasters and academic continuity planning in general. So back in January, the end of January, we got an email from the dean encouraging us all to activate our Zoom accounts that the college had bought. All the faculty had bought an institutional subscription to Zoom. And back at the end of January, the dean of faculty was encouraging us all to activate our accounts and become familiar. And at this point, I remember thinking that this seemed like a weird, unlikely scenario, right? Like it didn't even seem that we were planning for something that was going to be happening like nowish. It just seemed like, oh, the college is doing all of this planning like it does very well, just to think about possible scenarios in the future. So in this email at the end of January, right, we were told like Zoom, this will be exceptional circumstances, right? The dean tells us that he has no reason at all to believe that we're anywhere near a situation in which this kind of exceptional circumstance would happen, right? It's just kind of interesting to think back where we were mentally, like at the end of January. And then even in March, at the beginning of March, on March 4th, there was an email from the president sort of updating us on the president of CMC, updating us on various things. And I just kind of laughed when I went back to look at it because it starts off by saying, first, if you're unfamiliar with COVID-19. And it's just kind of funny to think that as of March 4th, right, that's basically 5 weeks ago, one would think that might be something that that one needs to, provide a link to a video to tell us what this virus is. And so that's where we were mentally. And actually March 4th, it's an interesting date for me because I was at the AF that night. There was a Gould-sponsored talk by Alex Kotlowitz. And I can't tell, there are too many participants now for me to see all the people who are on the call, but David Black, one of the Gould Center board members, was at the AF that night. And I was talking with him and we were talking about the upcoming Gould board meeting in April. And he was saying that he wasn't sure if he was going to be able to make it because of work. And then I said, well, regardless, I'll see you at graduation, because he has a son who's a senior. And he said, well, I don't know if colleges are going to be able to hold graduations now, given what's coming. And I had that thought at that point had never entered my mind. It was like this crystallizing moment for me on March 4th, where all of a sudden it just occurred to me like, wow, things could dramatically change. And already on March 4th, like when I met Alex Kotlowitz that day, you know, we had just gotten this email from the president that morning, you know, warning us about all this stuff. And I was like, yeah, let's not shake hands, right? So that whole evening at the Ath, I was walking around not shaking hands with anyone. And it felt very strange and new and peculiar. And that was just 5 weeks ago, right? So things progressed. And then as of March 11th, as you all know, that's when we decided at CMC to make the move to online teaching, and life has been very different ever since. But that was really just a month ago. And so when we think about how incapable we were, even 5 weeks ago, 6 weeks ago, to really think of what life was going to be like now, I think it does show us that we all need to do a better job of preparing our imaginations in the future for what's to come. This is a teachable moment for all of us in a lot of ways, but in particular in thinking relative to what I'm talking about today, in thinking about how we can better think about the future. So, well, this was just to remind us of where we are today. I mean, different sites are using different stats, but that was all a rewind. And now I want to fast forward a little, or now I really want to talk a little bit about imagination and the power of imagination and what we can do to use the current situation to help us think better about situations in the future. So I guess the point that I want to start with, and anyone who's heard me talk about imagination has heard me probably say this because it's one of the underlying features of my recent work. But I think it's very, very important for us to remember that imagination is a skill. And that means that it's something that we can get better at, okay? It's not as if the imaginative capacity you have is just the imaginative capacity that you have. Just like you can do things to improve your memory, you can do things to improve your memory. Just as you can do things to improve your memory, you can do things to improve your imagination. But it takes practice, right? These things don't just happen overnight. And so I always think it's really interesting when someone says something like, oh, I can't imagine such and such, or I'd never be able to imagine such and such. And there's a question that we have to ask ourselves is how much we try to imagine that kind of situation, right? If we spend 5 seconds here, or 5 seconds there trying to imagine something, that's not really doing the kind of imaginative work that we need to be doing, right? If you spend 5 seconds trying to improve your memory and then concluded, it's hopeless, it's never going to happen, right? Or suppose you're trying to learn some kind of new athletic skill. So an example I use, there was one time my son was trying to learn a new trick shot on the ping pong table, a trick serve. And I can't tell you how, because I could hear the ping pong ball on the table, can't tell you how many times he just tried that serve again and again and again and again and again. That's what you do to try and master some new skill, right? If you have to do it repetitively, and you have to keep at it, right? And not give up when you hit a sort of stumbling block. And I think the same is true for imagination, and we don't usually take the time to recognize that or to realize that. So that's sort of one starting point to think about what we can do now. One of the things that the current pandemic does for us, ironically, is that it gives us new experiential resources to draw upon in imagination going forward. So in general, what we do in imagination is scaffold out from experiences that we've already had to ones that we haven't had. And when we don't have that rich experiential base to draw upon, that's one thing that stilts imagination. So again, ironically, the more kinds of experiences we have, like the experience we're all having now in locked in our own homes or sheltering in place, hopefully safely at home, these kinds of experiences give us the capacity, the resources to imagine differently and hopefully better in the future. But so as I talk a little bit more about that, what I want to do is talk about some different uses of imagination. And in my work, I tend to distinguish between imagination in an instructive sense, which is when we really use imagination for things like decision-making and planning and brainstorming, okay, cases in which we're really trying to learn from our imaginative acts. And then imagination in a transcendent sense, in which we're maybe using imagination to transcend or to escape the world that we're actually in. So make-believe, acts of make-believe, children's games of make-believe, are also fiction and literature and movies and all those kinds of things. Those imaginative activities, we often engage in a sort of, use imagination in a sort of escapist way. So I think it's helpful just to keep in mind the different kinds of uses of imagination. And actually earlier this week, I know you can't read this, it's too small, but earlier in this week I was doing a mock class for the admission office for some admitted students who are eligible for some scholarships. And we were talking about imagination, and we made up a big list. You might be able to see it better here, but this was a list these 10 high school students came up with about different uses of imagination. And then they all in the class period together, we were categorizing them into these different categories. But some of the things that might be sort of interesting to think about is that they noticed that we can use imagination to question assumptions and break out of orthodoxy. One of the students said that we can think of that as a kind of imaginative liberation. And I told him I was going to steal that phrase for the future because I kind of liked it. But all of these problem solving, all these things in this problem solving category, brainstorming solutions, right, or social problem solving. We even had someone who must have been a rock climber in the group talking about how they used imagination during rock climbing to sort of imagine, well, I'm not going to pretend to be rock climbing, but to imagine where to put their hand on the finger holds and how they were going to get up the wall. So all of these are, those ones that I'm pointing out are very instructive uses of imagination, but you can see counterposed to them, we have some of the transcendent uses of imagination where we're trying to combat boredom, maybe by daydreaming. And by doing that, we're escaping from the reality that we're in, or when we're writing and storytelling. There are all kinds of escapist uses of imagination. So one of the things that's kind of interesting, I think, is that the way I normally think about imagination in an instructive sense is that in order for it to be useful to us, right, in order for us to really gain something from it, what we need to do is constrain our imaginative uses. And what I mean by constraining them is that we have to constrain them to fit the world as it is. Okay, so if you're trying to rock climb and you're trying to imagine where that toehold is, it better, because you want to be able to get up the rock face, you better imagine like the actual position of the finger hold or the toe hold, or there's going to be some kind of disaster. And likewise, if you're trying to do some sort of problem solving, right, you're trying to figure out maybe some sort of like corporate reorganization or who knows what, you have to think about the actual people involved, and you can't just, you know, fantasize about some different employees you might have and like how it will work if you had these, you know, fantasy employees, because instead you have the employees you have and you need to figure out what to do with those people. And so you constrain your imagination to at least some of the facts that are before you. So normally I think it's in the transcendent uses where we let our imagination go completely unconstrained, right? And that's where great literature and fiction and other kinds of fantastic games of make-believe come from, when we just let the shackles go. So we constrain our imagination for instructive uses. We let our imagination go unconstrained in the transcendent uses. But thinking about the imaginative failures with respect to the pandemic, I realized that perhaps sometimes in these instructive uses of imagination, we're really constraining our imagination far too much. And that's why we're having these failures, right? So we're too locked into the world as it is for us to really learn something from these imaginative exercises about different ways that the world could be, or how things could change. And so I have been starting to think that maybe the constraints that we normally place on imagination when we're using it for things like brainstorming and problem solving, those constraints just might be far too restrictive, and that what we should really be doing is loosening some of those restrictions in order to get at the full power of imagination. So I just thought it might be fun for you to see a couple of the kind, I talked before about practice in imagination, and I thought it would be fun for you to just see a couple of the kinds of exercises that people often talk about when they're talking about becoming more creative or practicing creativities. And so one of these is called the incomplete figures test. I actually did this with some students in an imagination seminar in the fall, but you give, this is usually with children, although you can do it with anyone, you give the group these incomplete figures and you ask them to use those lines in some kind of drawing and see what you could come up with. So I don't know if you sort of can see a picture in those figures or how you would draw it. We're not going to take the time to all pull out a pencil and pen to do that. But here are some things that, these aren't my students, these are just some standard examples, but here are some things that people come up with. I don't know if you can remember the original figure, but it was this squiggle here. Hopefully my laser pointer is working. It was this squiggle here, right? And then this here. And the creativity exhibited here is really quite extraordinary. And so these kind of incomplete figure tests are one way to practice thinking outside the box, seeing new possibilities in these shapes. There's another common exercise for creativity called the alternative uses test. So you ask standardly, how many different uses can you come up with for some simple object? And some of the objects are like a brick or a paper clip or a ping pong ball. And so you give people 2 minutes and ask them to make a list of how many different uses they can come up with. And then you can all actually grade these on your own. We did this in my seminar too, but you grade the list on these dimensions. So fluency, so just the sheer number of alternative uses you come up with. Originality, so how different those uses are from one another. So for example, if you're doing a brick and you say, oh, you can smash your brother with it, and you can smash your sister with it, you know, and you can smash your enemy with it. Well, that's 3 on the list, right? But they're not really that different from one another. So you get more points for originality, flexibility, the range of ideas and in different domains and categories, and then elaboration. So how much detail and development you put into the idea in those 2 minutes. And so one of the things that sometimes comes up when you're doing something with a brick is most of the uses that people come up with sort of take the brick as a given, right? So you can use it as a paperweight, right? Or you can use it as some sort of weapon, or you can use it as a building tool. But when you start to see the really creative uses is when someone says, oh, you can ground it up and then you have sand for your sandbox, right? Or other things that don't take, so there we have the more thinking outside the box. You don't take sort of the parameters of the brick as given. And so these are just 2, I don't want to say silly exercises, but 2 exercises that suggest that we can stretch our imaginations and that we can find various ways to practice thinking outside the box. And that will enable us in stretching our imagination in these ways. Then when we come up with these more pressing problems, right, and things to think about how we can envision these new threats facing our world, or how we're going to deal with these threats facing our world, right, or how we can each prepare, right? So who had the foresight to buy the toilet paper in late February, or who had the foresight to stock their cupboards, right? And I don't just mean in a crazy, obsessive hoarding way, but just in terms of really thinking about how bad things could get. Who had the foresight to talk to their students, right, before we sent them off back home. And now we're all in this weird new reality where we're engaging with our students in this new way, right? Who thought about these things in advance, thinking about how life was going to change. So I guess I didn't quite mean to go to the thanks slide yet, so let me just go back for 1 second so I can just finish my point. What I think we have to do in thinking about failures of imagination is remember that the future is not, the next thing that comes is not going to be exactly the same as the last thing that came, right? And so what we need to do is, just like we're not going to just use the brick to smash your brother and your sister, right? And you think of different uses. You have to think about the world and the future in expanding ways and different ways. And so we need to scaffold out from the experiences that we've had, sometimes quite far out, to see where we're going to end up. Okay, so I tried to keep it to about half an hour so that we'd have plenty of time for questions if there are some, and I think Evan and Jenna are going to field those.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Professor Kind. If you could stop sharing your screen,
yes,
then we can go back to seeing everyone who is speaking. And perfect. And just so everyone knows, there is 2 different ways you can view everything on Zoom, and it's in the top right corner. You can look at speaker view or grid view. If you're on speaker view, then it goes to whoever's speaking at that time. And of course, if you're on grid view, you can see 25 people. So we're going to start with Art Dodd from Los Angeles. And let me just get to you, Art, and unmute you. Art, go ahead.
So good morning, Amy.
Good morning.
Thank you. Going back to your failure imagination comments, I was in a mystery book group after 9/11, and we chose the book by Tom Clancy intentionally, where he has a plane flown into the Capitol building to kill the president, and Jack Ryan is elevated to the presidency. And there were members of Congress during the hearings who asked general officers about that. And they just said, once again, we could not conceive of such a situation. But my question would be, I'm also reminded of the George H.W. Bush comment about a failure of vision during this presidential campaign. So would you recommend that the Joe Biden and the Donald Trump get together with their political consultants and go through these imagination exercises themselves?
Well, I mean, how can I not answer that question with a yes? Yes, I think they should. Whether that's going to be at the top of their priority list, I don't know. But I do think that what probably makes a political consultant or political strategist useful in one respect, I mean, there's obviously lots else that they have to do, but is to help the candidates and the people that they're working with think realistically about how things could happen, like what we could face and what kinds of solutions will be needed to face those outcomes. So I was very interested in your mentioning the Clancy novel, because I think in the 9/11 Commission report, right after the remarks that I was quoting earlier, they mentioned the fact that these kinds of scenarios were often found only on the pages of, say, science fiction or some kind of speculative fiction, and they weren't being taken seriously by strategists, right, and by planners. And yet our creative authors, like, say, Tom Clancy, could think of these kinds of things happening. So it's not outside the realm of anyone's imagination, right? But so we need to make sure that the people who need to be thinking about these things are indeed thinking about these things, and not just trying to catch up to the previous threat or the previous problem that we faced in the past. So thanks for the question.
All right, we have a question from Amjad Khan. Amjad, I'm unmuting you.
Hey, can you hear me okay?
I
Yes.
can.
Professor Kind, I'm going to say professor because your presentation was just as good as it was 23 years ago when I took your course. Just amazing stuff. I am spending a lot of time watching Disney with my kids, like a
Yep.
lot of people, like a lot of parents. And I saw the Imagineering story of Walt Disney. And one of the things that intrigued me about that documentary was the institutionalization of people working on imagination and the kind of vision to build these engineers who are imagining things that seemed like they were transcendent at the time, but they're now so much a part of who we are. And it also reminds me of education. Like there's this place called Genelia Farms in Virginia, which is a neurobiological institute. And it was created for the very purpose of imagining new mechanisms, new understandings of the brain. And it literally was created to attract people in a different space. Genelia Farms, this kind of rural place, I think it's in Ashton, Virginia. And then the idea was that if you put enough people together and with the spirit of imagination, you can create incredible projects that have real lasting impact. Now, we see with that, it requires funding. It requires money. So it's kind of an interesting phenomenon now that there's a massive failure of imagination, but I'm curious to hear your thoughts about how institutions can think about, whether private, public, or in the academic sense, of institutionalizing imaginations or Imagineers in different fields. For example, Apple, the last example I'll say is Apple, they're working on face shields for ventilators. And they just quickly ramped that up in 30 days. And they just got the best research scientists and doctors all over the world for the simple question of reimagining the ventilator. And now they've acted on it in 30 days. So how can we make that more of a massive enterprise?
Okay, so let me think a little bit about that, and let me say it's nice to see you after 20 plus years, right? So you were in some of my first classes, I think, that I taught at CMC, so it's a pleasure. I mean, one silver lining of this whole thing is I'm getting to see some faces, even in just 1 by 1.5 inch boxes here that I haven't seen in a very long time, so I'm enjoying that. But so when you started your question, I was thinking about all of the actual developments that have come from the minds of writers and so on, that it was first imagined on screen or in a book, and then it became part of our world. So the flip phone, many people cite Star Trek as being the origin for that idea, right? So they imagined it in Star Trek and then they developed it in reality. And so when you were talking about some of the Disney stuff, that's what I was thinking of. I guess to get to your actual question there at the end, I think that one thing that we have to do as a society is to remember the importance of imagination, and we have to place value on it for its own sake, I guess, so that we're not, so that it's not just in these times of crisis where we're playing this kind of catch-up imaginative game, right? But that we applaud not just this sort of like assembly line production of various things, but the development of new ideas. And so I think some of the stuff going on, sorry if you hear stuff in the background, I locked my dogs out of the room, and now they're very angry because I've been in here for too long without them. But if they were in here, it would have been worse. So if you hear that scratching, that's what it is. I think some of the startups in Silicon Valley, like we hear tales of sort of idea swapping around a table, right? And so just where there's really no holds barred. And I think we need to have more of that no holds barred ideas, not just in times of crisis, but before times of crisis. So I guess I just want to applaud the examples that you give and say we need to have more of that, and we need to have it going on all the time, and not just in moments where it's dire. So.
All right, we're going to Ben Turner. Ben, go ahead.
Thanks, Evan. And thank you so much, Professor Kind, for your talk. It's really great to hear from you, and it's really helpful to have your perspective on this. My question is sort of focused on the idea of kind of empathetic imagination.
Okay.
And it seems as if sort of throughout this whole pandemic, there's been these failures on the part of North Americans, people in the West, to sort of understand the Chinese example, and then it kind of shifted to Italy and to Iran that are sort of more sort of traditionally Western adjacent. And even then, there were videos of Italian doctors sort of pleading with their 10-day past versions of themselves to imagine the horror it would become. So could you maybe speak to how to sort of retool our imagination from maybe the local or even the global when it comes to some of these things? Because it just strikes me as being the tool that we have to use the most as we deal with this as a world, as opposed to just like, you know, our fiefdoms of like our town or our province or state or things like that.
Sure. So you cut out for a second there, but I think I got the gist of it. And I'm very interested in the question of empathetic imagination and our ability to extend our imagination outwards towards people who are quite different from us. And actually, I mentioned in my talk the mock class I was doing earlier this week, and I was asked to give the students a light reading. And so I gave them a piece by Paul Bloom he's a psychologist that had appeared in The Atlantic, and he's presenting in that an argument against empathy. He's presenting an argument against empathy. He actually spoke at the ATH a couple of years ago and gave a version of this argument, but he thinks that empathy is problematic because it's biased and that we tend to empathize the most with the people who look like us or the people who are most like us. And he also presents arguments to say, you know, as nice as it is that you can get someone to donate money to a charitable organization, when you put up the picture of the one starving child, right? And you feel like, oh, I'm helping that child. The question is, why aren't we giving when it's all of these faceless people who are starving, right? Why do we have to see the picture of the one child to make us click the button to give our money? So, those are some of Bloom's criticisms of empathy, but I'm not willing to give up on empathy. I think it's incredibly powerful. So Bloom argues that we should just switch from empathy to what he calls compassion. And he says that we should have compassion for one another, but we shouldn't try really to empathize with one another. And I'm not willing to give up on empathy. I think a lot of what I said here about imaginative skill, I want to apply likewise to empathizing with others. And so I think one of the most important things that we can do, first of all, is to listen. Sometimes people contrast empathizing with listening, but for me, they go hand in hand, right? It's not like, oh, we listen to other people or we empathize with them. What we do is we listen to other people so that we can better empathize with them going forward. And so we make sure to take seriously the reports of others who are different from ourselves. And those reports might sometimes be coming from Ben, I think you were saying like overseas, right? We need to listen to these reports from far distant communities and not just stay in our little echo chambers where we're only talking to people who have very similar experiences to ours. We need to talk more widely and we need to listen more widely. And doing that, I think, will help us to hone our empathetic skills. And we also have to just remember and guard against the bias that we all bring to our empathetic practices. So
we'll go to a couple of questions in the chat, and then I'll go back to those that raise your hand. So Christine Welniak asks, as many of us will be stuck at home for a certain period of time, does Professor Kind have any suggestions other than the red brick or paperclip for us to work on our imaginative skills?
Okay, well, you know, you can play these red brick and paperclip games. Exercises to work on your imaginative skills while you're at home. Good, that's a great question. So first of all, I think that one of the ways in which we all generally practice imagination is through reading. And that's something that we all probably have more time to do now than we do normally. I mean, so once you've finished binge watching, you know, Tiger King, which, you know, we probably all have done. Once you've done with that, pick up a book that is maybe something different from what you'd normally read. Read widely. For those of you who have children, read with your children. Don't take the time when you're reading with your children to really pay attention to the books that you're reading them, right? You're not just parroting the words, but if you can get involved in the imaginative stories that you're telling them, then I think you can start to remind yourself of what it's like to imagine and to develop that skill of imagination. So I guess my first answer is going to be to engage with fiction, to engage with stories. That's one of the ways I think that we standardly increase our imaginative capacities, and it's something that we can all do right now. Maybe I'll stop there. I could probably come up with other things, but I like that answer.
Camille Gripe says, thank you so much for your time. And how do those of us working as artists, creating hopefully transcendent work, influence or help to push the world of instructive imagination?
Okay, can you read me that last sentence one more time? Artists?
How do those of us working as artists, creating transcendent work, influence or help to push the world of instructive imagination?
I see. Great question. So I guess I've been coming more and more to realize, and I said some of this in my talk, but I had always sort of like distinguished instructive and transcendent imagination and thought that they were two very different kinds of things. I mean, both imaginative, but two very different kinds of things. And I'm starting to come to realize how much the transcendent imaginings have to be fodder for the instructive imaginings, and that we have to do a better job of figuring out when we need to let the imagination run free. So as far as what artists can do, I mean, I myself am not an artist, and I don't know exactly what kind of art we're talking about, but if we're talking about if we're talking about fiction and poetry, I think keep engaging with the emotions that we're feeling, or a different range of emotions, to help the rest of us understand better. So going back to the previous question, or one of the previous questions about empathy, right? I think one of the reasons, actually it goes back to the previous question about empathy and the previous question where I recommended looking at stories. I think one of the reasons that looking at stories is good is that when we learn more about people's inner lives when we look at stories than we often do from talking with them. And we get that kind of depiction, and it's really a window into another way of thinking. And that's something that I think literature can do for us. With respect to art and music of other sorts, I think that the great works of art that are being produced now will probably be drawing on some of the experiences that we're having now and some of the emotions that we're having now, and helping us to process some of those. So that's something else I guess I didn't say about some of these acts of imagination. I think not only can they push us forward to help understand things in the future, but they can help us understand sort of what we're all feeling now, and they can help us better process the experience that we're having now. So that's something else that I think art can do. It can provide us with a sort of mirror or a window of sorts into the experiences that we're having.
We're going to go to Martin Kaplan next. Martin, go ahead.
Yes, my question is, how do you harness the imagination practically? In other words, you've got 12 people sitting around a table, and you come up with a variety of ideas. How do you decide what to focus on to become practical?
Well, that's a really good question, because it turns out, I guess, that some of the ideas that seem the most far off or the most far flung are the ones that we should have been focusing on, right? Like, so those crazy out there ideas are the ones that are turning out to be the ones that we should have been thinking more seriously about. So in terms of harnessing the power productively, I guess part of what I want to recommend is that we not be worried about always being too safe, right? And we not be afraid to take risks and to try something different. And that when, even if we can't pursue all of you have 12 people sitting around a table, even if we can't pursue all 12 ideas at once, let's not get locked into only the one that seemed like particularly sexy or dramatic and forget about the other 11. Right? So I think a lot of good ideas get lost when you're sitting around a table because one jumps out and then all the others get left behind. And so one recommendation I would have is not to orphan off those good ideas that come out through imagination, and make sure that we attend to those too, even if perhaps not quite so quickly. So we have a lot of brain power, presumably, when we get 12 people sitting together at a table, and probably there are more good ideas that are coming up than the ones that we can pursue realistically in the here and now. But let's not forget about the other ones that we can't at this exact moment take on. So I'm
going to go to Milan Reed in Utah.
Hi.
This is continuing the hit parade of former students. Hi, Milan.
Yeah. What I found a lot is people seem to think imagination's a waste of time. So for example, I'm kind of like a network security nerd, and I'm like, guys, you gotta set some good passwords. And people are like, oh, no one's looking for me, no one cares. I can't imagine that I would get hacked just because there's, 8 billion people in the world, yada, yada, yada. And like in that institutional setting, what would your response to that be? Like, you should imagine these things, you should worry about what could happen, not necessarily in a catastrophic way, like, oh, the world's going to end, but that idea that it's a waste of time to worry about stuff or to think about stuff that probably isn't going to happen, or you think probably isn't going to happen.
Yeah, well, I wasn't thinking you were going to go to passwords when you started that question. So I have to think a little bit about that example in particular. Like the password one is so silly because it's so easy to just pick another password, right? Like why not do so? That doesn't seem to me to take much imagination. I hope no one's going to try to go hacking into my emails now as I talk about passwords. I'm almost like floored by the idea that imagination could be a waste of time. I mean, maybe in that kind of comment that someone would make, they're thinking of only very fantastical examples of imagining of sorts. So like, oh, well, we're grown up now. We don't have time for make-believe, right? We're grown up now. I have a lot of things to do. I don't have time to just sit around daydreaming. And so it's there that what I would do is probably just remind someone who says imagination is a waste of time. I would say to them, look, when you bought your last sofa, right? When you were in the store buying the sofa, how did you decide which one to buy, right? I mean, maybe no one goes to stores anymore. Maybe you buy them online, but let's imagine that you're actually in a store, right? How did you decide which one to buy? Probably what you did was to imagine it in your living room. Right? And you can't bring each sofa home to test it out. So you have to do some imaginative work. Or when you go to the grocery store now and you're able to get a bunch of supplies, right? And then you're trying to load them into your car. How are you going to figure out like how to fit all of those things into your trunk? Well, probably what you're going to do is imagine like, oh, well, if I put the 20,000 rolls of toilet paper over there, then I'm going to have room for the 8 gallons of milk over here. Right? But before you start loading all the things into your car, you imagine like how the pieces are going to best fit together. And so I guess in response to the isn't imagination a waste of time, what I would try to do is remind people of how much they probably use imagination in their daily life for problem solving. And they are probably just not thinking of it under the rubric of imagination. And so maybe that would be helpful. That doesn't address part of the question about how do you get people to focus on imagining the worst or focus on imagining bad things that could happen. And I mean, one thing that one might say is maybe just to draw on some of these experiential resources we're developing now. And we realize like, hey, remember the last time you didn't imagine the worst and you didn't buy that extra 6-pack of toilet paper and how much you regretted it for the next month? Why not, add a couple of weird characters to your password now so that you're not regretting it if something bad happens. Right. Anyway, I don't know.
All right.
I don't know if that's particularly brilliant advice, but that's what I got right now.
Mark Schwartz came through with a couple of things on the chat feed. Mark, do you want to ask the question directly?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
So I want to use your skills that you outlined in this question, in this presentation, to answer the question, during the quarantine, what will people regret not doing once this stay-at-home initiative and requirement is lifted? It comes from, you know, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste. And when I can't sleep at night, sometimes I wonder, what am I going to regret not having done when I go back to a normal routine?
That is a great question, and it's something that I have been trying to think about myself, you know, and tell myself, like, no, you don't need to play that next round of Candy Crush, right? Wouldn't this be a great time to read a book, right? Wouldn't it be a great time to do these sorts of things that you haven't done? So I have been, so you ask, I mean, the question is, what are we going to regret doing? I guess I see one of the best things about this current situation, besides getting to see all your faces, is the family time that we've had. So I have 2 teenage boys, and we don't get to eat dinner together normally during the week, right? Because one of them's off at soccer and someone else is off at volleyball, and there's homework and craziness, and, you know, maybe I'm going to the ath and we're all running around. And now we get to actually have dinner together. We've been playing like board games as a family over dinner. And it's, you know, it's so easy to say, like, oh no, I have another email I should answer, or oh no, I should do a little more prep work for my class. And those things are important. Like, the emails are important to answer, and the prep work for my class is important. And I haven't even mentioned like the articles that I'm overdue on because I haven't been able to focus well. But that said, I'm trying to myself take advantage of the gift of this time with family, and trying to really remember that, like, I wouldn't normally get to enjoy this time with my sons this way, and I will really regret it in August or July or June or September or October or whatever month it is, you know, when we're all released. I will really regret it if at the end I realize, like, wow, I had all this time to spend with my sons and I didn't take advantage of that opportunity. And so that's what I'm doing. So that's not really general advice, but I guess what I would suggest to everyone is, I mean, this goes back to something that I started to say during the lecture, which is that imagination is a skill and we get better at it by practice. Also, what I didn't say is imagination is work. Like, I don't think imagination is just this happens by magic. I think we have to, like, sit down and imagine. And so for those of you trying to figure out what you would regret at the end of sheltering in place, and what kinds of things you would feel sad about, I would suggest that you, I mean, this is going to sound silly, but I mean this quite literally. You take a quiet second, right? Where you turn off everything and you just spend a minute or 2 minutes. I mean, 2 minutes is going to seem interminable if you actually sit down and do this. Spend 2 minutes thinking about that question, right? And so I think we don't often take the time to do the imaginative work. Like, we spend 5 seconds on it and we're done. So if you're thinking about avoiding regrets, I would suggest giving yourself a couple of quiet minutes to really think about what you want to get out of this time.
All right, we have Jeremy Steinman up next. Jeremy, you're unmuted.
Hi, Professor Klein. Thank
Hi.
you. Thank you for everything you've shared today. Appreciate it. So I work for a Hawaiian company that's, you know, struggling right now because there are no flights to Hawaii, and a lot of our business is related to tourism. And my question is, how do you distinguish between useful acts of imagination and acts of imagination that may be based in fear or trauma or paranoia, that might have like kind of a negative motivation? And to elaborate on that, you know, there's a conventional kind of idea that we will quarantine for a couple months and things will return to something that was resembling normal or different, but within the realm of what we expected, or what we expect from the past. And in some of the discussions that we have, we can choose to sort of continue on the path with what we were planning previously, or we can kind of become imaginative in a way that's like, do we change the business completely because it's never going to be the same? And sometimes I have trouble figuring out whether or not I should encourage the types of discussions that are further away, or kind of encourage the discussions that are sort of stick to the plan. So I was just curious about that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question and an interesting problem, right? Because we don't know right now how the world is going to fully change as a result of this. I mean, we have we have guesses, but would it be better to plan for a completely different reality, or would it be better to plan for life resuming more or less as normal? I mean, I hope this doesn't sound like I'm a cheap answer, but I guess I think it's important to imagine both, and that really you'd probably be doing yourself a disservice if we would all be doing ourselves a disservice if we focus too much on one alternative rather than the other, because we really are in sort of a state of uncertainty. And when we are in a state of uncertainty, we don't want to close those imaginative doors. So I would, I think new information is coming every day. That's one reason I actually went through the timeline, to sort of remind you of like how even just like a month ago, right? Like the kind of mental state we were in about like what life was going to be like. I think a month from now, we're going to be shocked by where we were, on April 10th, right? And what it felt like on that kind of day. So I think we have to recognize the uncertain situation we're in, and given that uncertainty, we have to be sure not to close any doors, imaginatively or otherwise. So.
All right, next we're going to Jay Tremblay in Chicago.
Evan, thanks. And if I break up, you can ask the question for me. Professor Kind, thanks for your remarks. What role do you see religion and imagination interplaying, particularly at such a trying time, and particularly this week, since we have both Passover and Holy Week? And for example, I have to imagine getting communion while watching Mass and other services online, because I can't go to church and receive communion. And that does take some imagination, I must say.
Yeah, so, and I mean, similarly, my Facebook feed was flooded with pictures of people having Zoom Seders earlier this week.
Right,
and
exactly.
It's, and there are all different kinds of ways in which people need to start implementing imagination to engage in the kinds of rituals that are so important to our lives, so important. We now can't do them actually, so we have to figure out new ways to do them virtually. So I think just like at the end of January, it would have been hard really to foresee how one could actually teach classes virtually, and how one could foresee going to a church service, right, and getting communion virtually. We're learning that we can adapt, and that we're better able to adapt than we might have thought. And so I guess I would also take our imaginative successes and try to learn from those going forward.
All right, Amy, it is noon, but there are also a few more questions I do want to get to. Do you have a couple more minutes?
I have a couple minutes. In case people have to start leaving, I just want to thank people for coming, and anyone who has to leave, I understand. But yeah, I can stay around and take a few more questions.
I'll add my thanks to everyone for being here as well. So Ann Cynic, who's a parent, mentioned, as a child, I never felt I was imaginative because I wasn't good at art. That was my frame of reference. No one ever told me I was imaginative until college, when a professor recognized aloud that he admired how original my questions were, that he felt I had an imaginative mind. I was stunned. It changed the course of my life, and I eventually went on to become a children's television and media producer, valued for my imaginative take on work. Do we tell our children they are imaginative? Do we nurture their different way of thinking? Do we affirm imagination as much as we do industriousness or good grades? I wonder what would have changed in my life had someone labeled me imaginative earlier. What are your thoughts?
So well, I'm so sorry that happened to you. I wish that we did value, I value imagination. I wish we as a society valued imagination the way that we valued other skills. And I think part of what I'm trying to remind people in reminding people that imagination is a skill is that it's not this sort of like either it's turned on or it's turned off, right? And just like I don't think that we should write people off as unathletic who aren't particularly skilled as third graders. I don't think we should write people off as unimaginative who aren't particularly skilled in a certain way as third graders, right? Because we can nurture these capabilities and we can nurture these skills. And we tend, I think, to put our energies on the things that we're already good at rather than focusing our energies on improving ourselves in a wider domain of skills. And I think that that kind of narrowing with our children, right? Like, oh, they're good at soccer, so they're gonna just do soccer. Or, oh, they're good at art, so they're gonna just do art. I wish we didn't have that kind of narrowing. And then the other aspect of your question that I wanted to say something about is that I really find it unfortunate, the association of like, oh, not being good at art and thus not being good at imagination. That's just so incredibly unfortunate, because as we saw from like the vast list of activities that imagination is involved in, I mean, you might be able to evidence your imaginative skills in rock climbing. You might be able to evidence your imaginative skills in ventilator design. You might be able to exercise your imaginative skills in all of these different ways. And we shouldn't associate imaginative skill with just such a narrow area. So for those of you who are parents, or for those of you who may one day be parents, in answer to some of the end questions there, I would say, yes, we have to nurture imagination, and we also have to avoid the narrowing of imagination.
Great. Robin Bartlett in New York had a few questions. Robin, I'm going to unmute you. Robin, are you still there? Robin? Robin might not be there. Okay. Let's see here.
I am here.
Oh, there you are. Hey, Robin.
Hi. So I had a question. At the very beginning of your presentation, you talked about the idea that creativity and imagination is impacted by one's past experiences and past creativity. So the question that I have is, how is the ability to recall the details of a past experience and a past creativity, how does that impact the future experience? Especially if the creativity happened a long time ago.
Okay, so one of the things that I think is important is that there is a lot of synergy between imagination and memory. And I think that's relevant to your question, because I think that the better able we are to draw on the resources from memory, the more resources that we will have for imagination to do its work. I also think that remembering how we've done something before, how we were creative in the past, I don't think is absolutely necessary for our imaginative success in the future, because insofar as we are trying to break down the walls, right, and think outside the box, we don't want to just keep repeating our past successes, right? We want to make sure that we're grabbing at new ideas. So we want to draw from the past, but we also want to extend beyond the past. And so I don't want to put too much emphasis on like remembering what we've done before. If that makes sense.
All right, we have a question from Ted's laptop. I'm guessing his name is Ted. Our ability to assimilate change has been challenged and stretched by the virus. How does the current global disruption and radical solutions to the COVID virus expand the framework for imagination applied to social change going forward?
Okay. Right. I'm just rereading the question also. So I think one of the things that's in the question is that things are so different in scope now, right? Like, who would have realized that we would be teaching all of our classes online, right? That there would be, no students on campus. That seemed like such a big, impossible thing. And now that's just like the least of it. So I do think that that insofar in that question, there's this idea that there's this like complete change of scope, and that what seemed to us to be impossibly large things now are no longer. Those are the things that now seem small to us. I think that we can learn from that going forward when we start to think about other kinds of crises and other kinds of situations. One thing that we might really want to focus on is how dramatic changes do change the scope of what we're dealing with. And things shift in importance, and they shift in size, and they shift in emphasis. And I think that being able to imagine those kinds of shifts is very hard, because it really, really requires you to step outside of your own current values. And as we were talking about with empathy, like the farther things are away from us, the harder it is to imagine. And so likewise, it's very hard to step outside your own current value system. But I think that insofar as we can try to do that, we will be better imaginers going forward.
Michael Fern asks, is imaginative skill used to anticipate future events different from imaginative skill in coming up with solutions? If so, are there different types of exercises for each?
So I don't know exactly how fine-grained we want to make all of these different imaginative skills. So there are, whenever we're talking about a skill, like, so when we're talking about a skill with respect to soccer, we can talk about, the skill of juggling versus the skill of passing versus, I don't know, I'm out of soccer skills that I can easily call up. But there are all these micro skills that all go up to being part of a good athlete. And so likewise, with respect to imagination, I think there are going to be all these different sub-skills that are going to be important. Now, whether the skill of imagining the problems and the skill of imagining the solutions is the same skill or not, I guess it sort of depends on how we look at it. So when in both cases, we need to make sure to guard against the kind of narrowing that I've been trying to guard against this whole time, right? So they both require us to expand out our world views. But it is true that in imagining solutions to a problem, we have a sort of focal point because we have the problem. And so our imagining in that case is sort of stemming from something in particular, whereas our work to imagine the problems, there's no focal point for us to get started from. So that makes me think that they probably are slightly different skills, because it's a question of how solid the starting points are. And probably both skills are going to be super important in general for imagination.
Thank you, Professor Kind. And Rob did send out your URL for your website and your book, so amykind.com/books, in case you want to see more of what Dr. Kind has researched and edited and published. I think I got to almost all the questions. I know I missed a few, so my sincere apologies, but I want to make sure Dr. Kind can go have lunch and enjoy her dogs and her kids. Professor Kind is usually around for a lot of alumni weekends and family weekends, and we thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate it. And for all of you who attended, thank you so much. We'll have professor talks every week. We'll have Professor Min-Chun Pei on Thursday of next week talking about our relationship with China post-COVID-19. We'll also have Professors Kyle and Shelton talking about the state of the economy and the consumer confidence next week as well. So please join us again and review our website for any further activity. If you haven't already, please do put your name and year and affiliation in the chat. Otherwise, thank you all very much. Dr. Kine, any last words?
No, I think I said this already, but it's so nice to see you all. And for the former students, it's just really great to have a quick glimpse of you in these little boxes. And I'm just really glad to have the opportunity to connect with so many CMC folks in this time of social isolation. This has been a fun part of my day. So thanks to you all for coming.
Great. Thank you all. Be safe, be well.
Be safe, be well. Wash your hands.